Good evening. I'm Molly Young from the Miami University Alumni Association. As part of the Objects That Changed the World lecture series organized by the Miami University Humanities Center and the Miami University Alumni Association, today we present Porcelain with Michael Hatch. Michael Hatch is Assistant Professor of Art and Architecture History and teaches the history of East Asian art. Professor Hatch was published in numerous exhibition catalogs and academic journals on the history of Chinese painting. He has written art criticism for the Brooklyn Rail, Art Forum International, artforum.com, and Aishu, Journal of Contemporary Chinese Art. From 2006 to 2008, he lived in Beijing, where he was a client relations officer at China's preeminent auction house, China Guardian. And before that, he worked in New York City at Kaikato Gallery. Questions were collected during registration, and Professor Hatch will address some of those throughout the webinar today. You'll also have the option to ask questions during the webinar by clicking Ask a Question on the bottom of your screen. Please note that in the interest of time we have available, we may not get to every question. Today's webinar will last about an hour, including time for questions and answers. Welcome to Professor Hatch, and thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Molly. Thanks for that kind introduction, the flattering version of my academic life. And good evening to all of you Miami alums. Thank you for being here. Thanks for making the time. My talk is part of the Objects That Changed the World lecture series, which is organized by the Miami University Humanities Center and the Alumni Association. This online lecture invites us to contemplate objects that fundamentally reshaped human experience, or the series that is. From concrete and porcelain to the birth of control pill and the first blues recording, each talk explores the history and cultural legacy of a transformative human creation. Sponsored by the Friends of the Humanities, Objects That Change the World celebrates the central role of the humanities in a Miami education and modern society. If you'd like to become a friend of the humanities, please consider a donation to the center in any amount. Annual gifts from Friends of the Humanities are indispensable to funding the Humanities Center's workshops, fellowships, student programs, and alumni outreach efforts. Fulfilling the center's commitment to students, to faculty, and to the public would not be possible without your help. Please join the generous alumni and friends who have already invested in the future of the humanities. Every dollar really does make a difference. To learn more about the important work that the Humanities Center does at Miami, go to www.humanities.center.miamioh.edu. And if you'd like to donate, click on the red box at the bottom of the registration page that you used for this lecture, or go to www.givetomimiaoh.org/Humanities Center. And thanks for allowing me that brief plug. So I've already been introduced, so I won't go through the belaboring exercise of telling you who I am, other than to say that I'm really proud to be here at Miami. This is my 5th year, and I teach a survey of East Asian art, which is where I kind of have my broadest intersection with the population of students. And I teach a bunch of upper level courses, one on Chinese painting that I'm teaching this semester, one on modern and contemporary East Asia, and one that I'm teaching this year on the history of the art market, in which students get to actually buy an artwork for the museum, which makes it a really fun, engaged sort of lesson in the humanities, applying humanities research, and then in giving back in a way to Miami by contributing to the collection. Speaking of the art market, let's begin with some fun recent news. This little headline might have popped up on your radar, your clickbait, your Facebook page, however it is you get news these days. And it tells the kind of story of an Antiques Roadshow dream scenario where somebody, I think just last year, went to a yard sale in New Haven, Connecticut, found a bowl they liked, bought it for $35 at the yard sale, and then flipped it the next year, just recently, just a few weeks ago, for over $700,000. And for many of us, blue and white, as this bowl is decorated in blue and white contrasting motifs, right? Blue and white is what we think of when we think of classical porcelain. And this piece from the Yongle era of the Ming Dynasty is also quintessentially kind of the epitome of porcelain to many of us. Ming Dynasty blue and white almost comes together as a set phrase. As the essay accompanying this piece goes to pains to explain, this particular object is quite rare. There are only 6 others like it, and it sold for a correspondingly rare amount of money. But for most of us, the difference between this $700,000 bowl and this set of 4 bowls for sale online for $64 is negligible. Blue and white bowl is a blue and white bowl. What's more, you could probably go down to your local thrift store and get an even cheaper set of blue and white porcelain bowls. An inability to understand the difference between these two is partly because porcelain today is so ubiquitous. You've probably already interacted with porcelain at least a dozen times today, starting with your coffee mug, or your tea mug, or whatever it is you drink your hot beverages out of. Porcelain is, of course, the stuff of your basic hallmark tchotchkes. If you have a grandma who is indeed the world's greatest grandma, you might buy her a little porcelain gift. Of course, it's technologically useful as well. Any of you who have rambunctious dogs, any of you who have spent time on a farm, have probably seen porcelain insulators along an electric fence. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out, in somewhat polite terms anyway, that porcelain is practically synonymous with basic human sanitation. So how then do we get from there to here? How do we explain the price of some porcelain bowls at $700,000? What is the story of porcelain to us? To many people, the story of porcelain is the story of the modern global economy. Porcelain is arguably one of the first early modern global commodities. The history of porcelain in a world trade network like the one visualized here, at least in relationship to a Western Eurocentric model, begins in the 13th and 14th century as trading routes over land brought porcelain into the increasingly wealthy city-states of the late medieval period and the early Renaissance period. Porcelain traveled by sea during the so-called Age of Exploration as Portuguese set sail around the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, eventually arriving in India in the late 15th century, and kicking off the colonial era, which is marked by the East India trading companies, among many things. These conglomerate companies, in many people's minds, the first mega companies or mega conglomerates that traded in spices, in tea, and of course in porcelain across the world. Many of you might have heard of the Dutch East India Company. There was also an English East India Company, a French, a Swedish East India Company, and briefly an American East India Company. Porcelain was a high-value luxury good, and this trade was driven by an East Asian, porcelain, which was a high-value luxury good, had a demand that was driven by, in part, a monopoly on the technology to produce it, which is something we'll come to later in the lecture. Europeans don't attain the necessary technology to produce something like porcelain until around the year 1700, which means that for several centuries, the only porcelain came from East Asia. But the trade in porcelain across cultures and seas predates this Western-centered narrative of the rise of a global economy. During Europe's medieval period, or the Dark Ages, as it's often called, there was a robust global trade already that connected China with South Asia, with Central Asia, and the Islamic world. by land and by sea. So the history of porcelain, therefore, is a vehicle to think about the modes of intercultural exchange and trade that predate and even anticipate our own interconnected global economy. And the rest of this lecture will go on to describe the origins and development of porcelain from the 8th century onward. And then we'll pay particular history to the trade in blue and white porcelain as a kind of object that changed the world, a sort of driving engine for the early global economy, by which desire and exchange and profit connected the world. Of course, there are many other things, as many of you are probably quite aware of, that might count as commodities that mark the early global world, and the other things that were traded along with porcelain: spices, silk, tea, of course. And many of these things might be justifiable, right, as the kind of subject for a lecture like this. But porcelain has this extra benefit that those materials and commodities don't. It has the benefit of enduring. Not only that, it's an object that has a defined use value as well as an almost infinitely expansive symbolic value. Through the various forms of decoration and reinvention, we can watch the complicated paths that initially a very local visual culture takes as it spreads across the early modern world, where its signs are taken first as evidence of the exotic other, and then are appropriated and incorporated into new visual cultures in new locales, all by means of this vehicle, porcelain. So the story of porcelain is the story of the global modern global economy. It's the story of technological monopoly in East Asia, of a luxury brand, you could say, and of intercultural exchange. So let's begin with the origins of porcelain by differentiating porcelain from other kinds of ceramics. Beginning with earthenware on the far left. The pot you see was excavated from a burial site in China and is dated to around 2500 BCE. It's associated with the Majiao culture. And the cross sections of each of these, as you see below, tells us a lot about how these things were made. The pot on the far left is what we tend to call earthenware. It involves a clay, which is often filtered and sifted through a purification process, but still has lots of inconsistencies, as you can see in the cross section, various kinds of grit and other sorts of impurities in the material. And what's more, it lacks the right kinds of chemical agents to produce porcelain, which I'll get to in a minute. When you touch earthenware, as many of you probably have, even if you haven't been aware that this is earthenware as opposed to porcelain, it has a different feeling. It's lighter. If you knock your finger on it, right, it has a kind of a dull, hollow sound. And to fire objects like these, to get them to set into their final forms, the kiln, the specialized oven for baking ceramics, is usually fired at somewhere around 600 to 1,000 degrees Celsius. But you can't go over 1,000 degrees, because at over 1,000 degrees, the pot will collapse, invert on itself, and turn into an unusable pile of slag. The middle object is an example of what we might call early porcelain, and sometimes it's called stoneware, but is, at least in Chinese, differentiated along with later styles of ceramics under the words which designates porcelain, at least in Chinese. It's a more durable, more luminous, more sonorous, that is, it makes better sound when you touch it, form of ceramic. And part of the reason for that is the temperature and the material. Temperatures for stoneware or early porcelain have to go above 1,000 degrees, but end up sitting somewhere below 12,000 degrees Celsius. This bowl was probably produced in the middle of the 8th or 9th century, which corresponds to the origin moment, really, for porcelain technology and early porcelain in particular. the last sort of step in the slow evolution of porcelain in China is what many people like to call true porcelain, which is often associated with a specific site of Jingdezhen, which is in Shanxi province in central China. And the differences here are, of course, temperature and materials. The temperature in this case rises to over 14,000 degrees Celsius. And the two materials that go into making it are a kind of clay called Kalden Clay, which is a sort of bastardization of the site Gaoling or Gaoling Mountain. And it's a clay with a high silicate content. And that is combined with a slurry made from a particular rock called Petunse, which is, again, a Romanized version of Baidunze, a feldspathic rock that's mined also nearby. So consider just for a moment technologically what's necessary here. You need to go find clay in a clay deposit buried in the ground, usually near a river, right? And then you also need to go into the side of a mountain, into a mine, and mine this other material and combine these things together in the right combination to produce this high silicate material. When fired at 1400 degrees Celsius, fuses and creates a new crystalline structure. The minerals realign, and all of the space between the crystals is basically driven to 0%. It has what's called 0% porosity, right? No water can get in. There's no space between the crystals whatsoever. This process of vitrification turns the porcelain into something almost glass-like. And sometimes porcelain is even nearly transparent. You can see light passing through it. And then, of course, there's modes of decoration. Earthenware is decorated with what's often called a slip, a painted slurry of clay that is where a mineral is added, in this case an iron mineral, over top to get it to alternate in colors. And then in the other two glazes, you have a bit of copper to make the middle one go green, and cobalt in the last example to get the blue, alternating blue color. So the glaze is added after the initial firing at these various temperatures and of these different materials that create this crystalline structure of varying degrees of reduced porosity and increased structure, crystalline structure. This particular early piece of porcelain comes from the Yue kilns, which is where most people agree the early sort of proto-porcelain was first made. The green glaze is called celadon, at least from a European perspective. And this particular object, although it looks kind of ugly, right? It's chipped on the rim, it's got this ugly stain on the bottom, is particularly special. It was found in the crypt underneath the Famun Temple in Shanxi province, which is where another major historical object was found, a reliquary of the Buddha's finger bone, an object which forms an integral moment in late Tang Dynasty history and in the transition away from Buddhism and toward a kind of revival of Confucianism, which is something we don't have a lot of time to get into. But suffice it to say that buried alongside this precious object, right, a reliquary that holds the supposed finger bone of the Buddha, were a series of bowls glazed in celadon and in this porcelain. We know from the inventory found alongside these objects in the sealed crypt that this was sealed up in 874 and wasn't opened until 1987, when the collapsed pagoda over top revealed the crypt below. And the inventory also describes this glaze as being a mise, or secret, or mysterious color. And what was interesting about this is the fact that there were historical records of people talking about this marvelous green glaze. But that name of the particular kind of green glazed celadon couldn't be attached to any particular object. And it wasn't until this inventory associated with these particular bowls came out that scholars knew what mise, green glazed porcelain, looked like. Now having an object and a color and a tone to attach to this thing that had been talked about so reverently in historical examples. And porcelains, even from their sort of early invention, became objects of luxury in China. They were expensive, of course, more difficult to make than regular earthenware. And poems exist extolling the kinds of virtues and beauty of porcelain bowls, like the one seen here, dating from around the same time, the invention of porcelain, really. And it's in the tradition of poems on things, or odes to objects. So the Lu Huimeng poem from 881, I'll try to read it with some justice to the author's words. The autumn breeze blows and the Yue kilns are lit to capture the green color of 1,000 peaks. Let us take the cups out at midnight to collect the falling dew, or fill them with the wine in emulation of Qi Kang. So one thing to notice here is that the Yue kilns are specifically mentioned as this famous site for porcelain production. Another thing to notice is the way in which the color is emphasized, this green color being like the condensed green of 1,000 different mountain tops, or like something akin to a vessel for holding the dew that comes from the early morning. And the second poem reiterates this, by Xu Jin, someone who was also a 9th century poet. He writes, newly glazed in auspicious jade-like colors, the finished bowl was first offered to my lord. Skillfully molded like a full moon dyed with spring water, deftly turned like a swirl of thin ice holding green clouds, like a moss-covered ancient bronze mirror, present at this occasion, a tender dew-soaked lotus leaf parted from the river's edge. So in his poem, he's focusing on these ideas of a kind of suspended color, right? Spring water with a full moon that dyeing it, reflected, that is, in the surface of the water. Or a swirl of thin ice in which green clouds are suspended. Both of these are focusing also on modes of production, or sites of production, and an obsession with sort of natural metaphors of verdancy. As porcelain developed, it became associated with other kinds of cultures of taste and of wealth, such as the culture of appreciating tea, which was an essential part of Buddhist practice. That crypt that I showed you before, the Faman Temple crypt, also had a famous silver and gold tea grinding and storage set. And tea appreciation is part of general literati or gentlemanly behavior in periods like the Song dynasty. For example, Emperor Huizong, an emperor in the late part of the northern Song dynasty, so that is the early 12th century. Someone who is famous for his refined taste writes a whole treatise on tea. And in that treatise, he talks about tea cups in particular, and what color was the best for contrasting the different temperatures and colors of the tea as you appreciated it. So these two cultures are intertwined. The Song dynasty court also had imperial contracts with specific kiln sites to produce glazed wares that were only available to the court, such as this Rue Kiln Ware. And if you thought that our blue and white example from earlier was an expensive auction purchase, if you can find an authentic Rue Kiln Ware, you're also going to be quite wealthy. One of the interesting things that happens, of course, is that, when you have a technology that's invented, like porcelain in 8th century China, is that it travels. It travels within East Asia first as a kind of technology, as a know-how that moves with general trade routes. It moves with envoys moving between the various courts of the kingdoms of East Asia. It moves with displaced people displaced by war and dynastic change. And it moves with artisans who might be displaced by some of these political and economic events. And so porcelain technology already exists in Korea by the 9th century. And this is through trade and also through the movement of artisans over these borders. So much, and the porcelain technology there became so refined that in the 12th century, when a minister from the Song Dynasty court named Xu Jing travels to the Goryeo court, on the Korean peninsula, and writes a record of his experiences there, he says that the Korean artisans are actually doing a much better job at creating porcelain than the Chinese are. He marks Korean celadons as first under heaven. That is first ranking in their qualities of sophistication in terms of shape, in terms of color, etc. And porcelain technology moves to Japan in the late 16th century. And in this case, war is what causes the artisans to not move by choice, but to move by abduction. In the late 16th century, a general named Toyotomi Hideyoshi tries to invade China by first invading Korea in the 1590s. He dies midway through this campaign, and the armies retreat back to the islands of Japan. And this war is sometimes called the War of the Potters because on the way back, the armies abduct artisans to produce porcelain in Japan in order to make Japan an economic player in the growing global economy in which porcelain played a central role. Now, during an earlier period, before the abduction of these poor Korean ceramicists by the Japanese armies, during the Mongolian conquest of Central Asia that united Central Asia with East Asia and Eastern Europe, there were many opportunities for the kinds of cultural and physical exchange of bodies, of ideas, of objects that we associate with the rise of the early modern world. And many of those exchanges and ideas and sort of travels of people can be traced through the paths that porcelain took. One of the more interesting connections, at least from today's perspective, in terms of thinking about museum collections, that occurs with this integration of East Asia with the Islamic world, is collections like the one at the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. This was the seat of the Ottoman Empire from the middle 15th century all the way to the early 20th century. And it boasts the world's largest collection of Chinese porcelain at more than 12,000 objects. Over 3,000 of those are these green glazed wares, celadons, making it the single largest collection of celadons in the world as well. This collecting began with the early Ottoman sultans in the 14th century, and legends became attached to the sort of apotropaic or protective functions of this green glazed porcelain. Legend had it that if a food you were served was poisoned, when it was placed in the celadon, the poison would leach out and become apparent. It would separate from the food. Of course, that's not the only reason. It might have been collected naturally, as it was also a sign of great luxury. If you had a whole banquet service of porcelain, you were dining in the sort of peak style for the period, and marking yourself really as a global player. Now, the connection to the Islamic world would also lead to the blue and white decorative schemes that came to define Chinese porcelain. This decorative preference for a white ground on which blue motifs stand in contrast actually begins in the Islamic world, in places like modern-day Iraq and Iran, during the time when they were ruled by the Abbasid Caliphate. And part of the reason here is that this is where cobalt mines existed. Cobalt, when added to a glaze, when fired, turns into a really rich, deep blue color. And cobalt, in particular from Iraq and Iran, had a pollutant, had an arsenic element to it, which drove the color into this deeper, richer pigment than cobalt from other sources. And so it became an expensive, but also integral material factor in the production of blue and white porcelain. And when China was connected to Central Asia through Mongolian rule, this taste found its way into the factories of Jingdezhen in Jiangxi province, which had become the center of porcelain production, as it was close to some of the best materials, that Kalden Clay and the Patunsa rock. Which is to say, porcelain at this point is being made in the heart of China, initially for export to suit the tastes of people in Iraq and Iran. And while blue and white becomes popular at the Chinese court under Mongolian rule and becomes even more popular after the end of the Mongolian Empire, when the Ming Dynasty takes over, it's really in the connection with the Islamic world that these kinds of decorative schemes become dominant, even though the material base, that is porcelain in China versus the earthenware base in Iraq, was dramatically different. And images like this help us understand really how rare and precious blue and white porcelain was considered in Europe at around the time of the Renaissance, circa 1500, when Andrea Mantegna paints this oil distemper on linen image of the Holy Family with the three magi. Mantegna was a Renaissance painter based in the northern Italian city of Mantua, and he was patronized by the Gonzaga family to make images that, of course, suited the patrons and the audiences of northern Italy during the Renaissance. And so the image here, the narrative, of course, is one that's probably recognizable to many of you. On the left-hand side, you have these three haloed figures, the Holy Family. Baby Jesus in the foreground, being held by his mother Mary, and backed up by his father, his stepfather? I don't know how to put this. Joseph, right? And on the right-hand side, you have the three magi. But of course, they're not in their circa 0 BC versions, right? There's not an imagination on Mantegna's part of what it must have looked like for these three wise men to have traveled circa the year 0. They're put in terms of late 15th century wealth. These three magi actually represent the three foreign trade empires that were most important to the Italian Renaissance mindset. North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, and the Chinese Empire. And it just so happens that that focus in the foreground, that is the eye contact that the infant Jesus is making with this figure in the foreground who looks up reverently, offering his gift of gold in a porcelain, blue and white cup, is the most important compositionally in this image. Now, this figure in the foreground may not look Chinese, but Italian people at the same time would have identified him as such by the blue and white bowl filled with gold, and also by some of the features, such as his bald head, his long beard, his animal skin sort of shawl. And in all likelihood, the model that they were drawing was from porcelain painted or porcelain figured images like this image here of Zhenwu, a folk or Taoist deity in China associated with the North. So the story of porcelain is, in many ways, the story of the modern global economy, which is dominated by the Portuguese at first, right? They sail around the Cape of Good Hope first. They establish these trade routes. But when in the late 16th century, Spain and Portugal come together, this empire is put in conflict with the growing English and Dutch empires. And the Dutch East India Company, the English East India Company, and the various other East India companies, which come to be responsible for most of the age of exploration in terms of trade, right? These companies arose really out of a rivalry for control over these trading routes. The Dutch East India Company is formed just after the English in 1602 and really dominates trade until the end of the 18th century in 1799. And as I mentioned before, many scholars look to these models of trade as the origins of early modern global capitalism, and consider these East India companies in terms of the way they were structured, in terms of the way they were funded, as the first mega corporations. And among the things these mega corporations specialized in terms of trade was porcelain. And blue and white was the preferred method of glazing and decoration on the porcelains that were in demand in Europe at this time. Now, along these, I'm sorry here, I'm having a little technological difficulty. Along these trade routes, other people were traveling as well. It wasn't just traders. The Jesuits being perhaps of the most primary importance. The Society of Jesus, also called the Jesuits Society, was founded in 1534 by St. Ignatius of Loyola and given papal approval 6 years later in 1540. And these Jesuits saw it as their mission to travel to outflung parts of the expanding global world that they were in along these trade routes to convert people to Catholicism, in part because at this time in Europe, as many of you likely are sort of understanding or signaling or from your previous knowledge, there was, of course, the Reformation happening, which was taking away practitioners from the Catholic Church. The first of these Jesuits to arrive in China is Matteo Ricci, shown here in a print on the right. He arrives in 1583 and moves from Macau, the major Portuguese trading hub, to Nanjing, a city inland in Ming China, where he tried to begin to convert the upper classes. And among the things that these Jesuits did in China was to translate Confucian texts and to tell stories about what life was like in China. And this really sparked a wave of fascination and a craze for all things Chinese in China that we refer to by the term chinoiserie. So the Jesuits were the conduits for this. They traveled on these trade routes, and they wrote these books that became wildly popular, and these accounts of China became widely popular in Europe. And among the things that they tried to do in China was to steal the secrets of porcelain production. There was a little bit of industrial espionage tucked in on their trade missions in order to, of course, upset this monopoly that China had on this desired good that brought such profits when traded. And it's at this point that the estimation of China really rises to its most astronomical or zenith, I guess is the best way to put it, in European eyes. People like Gottfried Leibniz, who is known as a mathematician and a philosopher, wrote about China in absolutely glowing terms, most of which he got from these texts being written by Jesuits. He never traveled to China himself, but he felt the authority to write things like, human cultivation and refinement should today be concentrated in the two extremes of our continent, in Europe and in China, which adorns the Orient as Europe does the opposite edge of the earth. Perhaps Supreme Providence has ordained such an arrangement so that as the most cultivated and distant peoples stretch out their arms to each other, those in between may gradually be brought to a better way of life. Now, the Chinese Empire, which challenges Europe in cultivated area and certainly surpasses her in population, vies with us in many ways in almost equal combat, so that now they win and now we. In profundity of knowledge and in the theoretical disciplines, Leibniz goes on to say, we are their superiors. And he mentions logic, metaphysics, and the incorporeal, that is knowledge of God. The mathematical, the astronomical, etc. And he says they also yield to us in military science. And this is where he begins to sort of really expand his fantastical ideas of what China is, when he goes to praise China for yielding to the Europeans in military science, not so much, he says, out of ignorance, but as by deliberation, for they despise everything which creates or nourishes ferocity in men, and almost an emulation of the higher teachings of Christ, and not, as some wrongly suggest, because of anxiety, they are averse to war. Certainly they surpass us, he goes on, though it is almost shameful to confess this, in practical philosophy, that is, in the precepts and ethics of politics as adapted to present life and to the use of mortals. Indeed, he says, it is difficult to describe how beautifully all the laws of the Chinese people, in contrast to those of other people, are directed to the achievement of public tranquility and the establishment of social order. Now, these ideas that Leibniz is talking about, this sort of fantasy of a China that is beyond war, that is focused on philosophical and moral and ethical behavior rather than sort of conflict with one another, is coming particularly from the translations of Confucianism that find their way into the letters that come back from the Jesuits. And those of you with a knowledge of religious history know that it is this issue of whether Confucianism constitutes a religion or a philosophy that ultimately leads to the downfall of the Jesuits within the Catholic Church. Again, something that we don't want to belabor here, other than to say that this network of trade in which porcelain sits as a kind of main object also facilitates networks and exchanges of ideas and of philosophy and of a kind of Orientalist or chinoiserie aesthetic that really does dominate European life in the 17th and early 18th century. Some of the more subdued versions of this fad for all things Chinese might be Dutch still lifes. If you look at Dutch still lifes in a museum, you'll see that for the most part, what they're depicting are a variety of luxury goods that are somewhat casually laid about, as if someone had just finished a fantastic meal in which you have a silver ewer reflecting the brilliant yellow tones of various citrus fruits, which had been imported from abroad. Stacked in the background are gilded glass goblets, and the remains of this beautiful citrus meal are found in a blue and white glazed large bowl. Again, pointing to the role of these luxury goods in luxury, high-class enjoyment and in signaling wealth throughout Europe. Moving beyond the Dutch example, you have somewhat more flamboyant examples of this excessive interest in all things Chinese, such as the so-called porcelain cabinet or Chinese room at the Schloss Charlottenburg in Berlin. This was decorated in the early part of the 18th century, 1706. And as you can see, porcelain is not used here so much as a singular object of appreciation as it is in the Dutch still life, or an object of use value in terms of putting materials into it. It's used as wallpaper, and a mirrored background is put behind these various shelving units done à la chinoise. From a French perspective, I don't know how to say that in German, not one of my languages, with little Chinese adornments and paintings at the bottom. The chinoiserie aesthetic, this imagining of China from a European perspective, is of course found in all sorts of other visual arts, even if it stems from primarily the trade in porcelain and to some degree textiles. Francois Boucher, this famous 18th century painter, painted a number of scenes in which these reveries of Chinese pleasure are being enacted by Europeans. Jean-Baptiste Billemont, a famous Rococo designer, late 18th century designer, pioneered the style of appropriating different ideas from porcelain and driving them to their kind of decorative extreme. For instance, these pavilions and rocks here, which are the sort of emaciated forms of landscapes drawn from porcelain, here stand on stilts as if defying gravity, and find their way into these floral vignettes that imitate Chinese fans as well. And this is a classic example of Orientalism as directed toward East Asia, a fantasy of the exotic other that is constructed for the entertainment, for the pleasure and comfort of Europeans, but which is also used to justify authority over the Orient, to prop them up as a kind of mythical land anchored in ideas of the past and not particularly present or modern, and therefore serving, of course, fantasies about what European civilization was. And this chinoiserie aesthetic wasn't just confined to Europe. It spread everywhere that the networks of European trade and colonization existed, such as New Spain or modern-day Mexico. A crucial anchor in the colonial world for European superpowers. And New Spain was part of this network of exchange of Chinese goods. The colonies of the New World provided the raw silver that was used to pay for the goods, such as tea and silk porcelain, when the ships arrived in China from the New World. And the objects placed into this mosaic fountain in Mexico City are generally considered to be the ones that kind of fell off the boat. That is, they broke, they were scratched in transit, and were therefore appropriated into this fantastic design that is part of, actually, I don't know whether this is vernacular or church architecture. It says Casa del Risco, so I guess vernacular architecture in the colonies of the New World, which operates a lot like the Schloss, Charlottenburg Palace, that is, in terms of using porcelain not as an object for its kind of functional value, but purely as a decorative scheme. And the spread of porcelain across these networks leads to local industries of imitation. On the far left, you have a 17th century tin-glazed earthenware vessel, so not porcelain, made in Mexico. It's generally called Talavera ware, named for the town outside of Mexico City where these were potted. In the middle, you have a whole set, a garniture, used to decorate the top of large cabinets in Europe, and particularly in the Netherlands, made of Dutch Delft ware, which is also, like the Talavera ware, a tin-glazed earthenware. And on the far right, you have Vietnamese glazed stoneware. So a step up in terms of the base material, because again, this is closer to East Asia. Artisans have traveled to Vietnam, and Vietnam was tangential to and part of, at some periods in time, the Chinese Empire, or parts of Vietnam were anyway. And so what you can see by placing all of these together is a consistency of motif, a consistency of certain kinds of shapes or ideas about how shape should be formed, certain contractions and swellings of the vessel. And patternings that, again, if you remember, originally come from 9th and 10th century Central Asia, travel to China, and then are decorated and reimagined throughout the network of trade of the early global modern world by local artisans. And they take on local ideas about design, and they become local. They're appropriated and changed in their new manifestations. Now, the key difference here between these objects, other than place, is that none of these is actually porcelain, right? They're all, except for the one on the far right, which is a kind of early porcelain, they're all this material that could not yet be made in Europe. China still had the monopoly on this technology. It wasn't until the very beginning of the 18th century when Augustus the Strong, Elector of Saxony, King of Poland, and Grand Duke of Lithuania, these guys had so many great titles, hired an alchemist, which is also kind of fun, right? Named Johann Friedrich Böttger, to first produce gold. That's what he was after. He basically convinces Böttger to be in residence at his court to make gold out of other things, which we know is impossible, but which is an idea that fascinated early modern European folks. But secondarily, he was asked to try and develop porcelain because that technological monopoly, again, was still in East Asia. And the secret of porcelain, as Böttger discovered, almost accidentally, was higher temperatures and, of course, this high silicate material. Some of the letters that had come from the Jesuits had indicated that the material had to be different, and there was a lot of experiments with this, producing things like soft paste or bone porcelain, in which these added elements tried to increase the likelihood of vitrification. But the temperatures weren't raised enough to produce true, or what's sometimes called hard paste porcelain. And part of that was because of the knowledge that if you raise the temperature too high for other kinds of ceramic, like earthenware, things collapsed, right? The vitrification didn't happen. Instead, what you had was a melting of the material. So in 1709, this is discovered in Europe, and all of a sudden, East Asia no longer has a monopoly on the technology. Augustus the Strong establishes the Meissen porcelain manufactory in Germany, which many of you might have heard of. And over the 18th century, the ability of Europeans to produce their own ideas about porcelain led to a decline in the demand for porcelain in China and in Europe. And by the mid 18th century, the fad, or the previous fad for things Chinese, or the sustained fad, especially among the rising middle classes of the 18th century, was openly mocked by poets like Cawthorne. And this is an excerpt from, he was an English poet, from his poem Of Taste. And I've used an illustration here that talks about, or that illustrates some of the things he's talking about from a William Hogarth painting of around the same time, where you have a kind of bored couple practicing the fashionable marriage, or marriage a la mode. Cawthorne writes, "Of late 'tis true, quite sick of Roman Greece, we fetch our models from the wise Chinese." I'm trying to rhyme this here. "European artists are too cool and chaste, for Mandarin only is the man of taste, whose bolder genius fondly wild to see, his grove a forest and his pond a sea, breaks out, and, whimsically great, designs without the shackles of rules or lines. Formed on his plans, our farms and seats begin to match the boasted villas of Pekin. On every hill, a spire-crowned temple swells, hung round with serpents and a fringe of bells. Junks and ballons along our waters sail, with each a gilded cockboat at his tail. Our choice exotics to the breeze exhale, within the enclosure of a zigzag rail. In Tartar huts our cows and horses lie, our hogs are fatted in an Indian sty. On every shelf," here's where this illustration makes sense, "a joss divinely stares, nymphs laid on chintzes sprawl upon our chairs, while o'er our cabinets Confucius nods midst porcelain elephants and Chinese gods." And this sort of shift in the attitude towards China and toward the fad for displaying porcelain is part of the rising ability for Europeans to produce their own versions of porcelain objects. So a decline in demand, which leads to cheaper porcelains, which leads to porcelain being available to rising middle class, which is where you get some of this judgment coming from Hawthorne on people decorating and overburdening their mantles with Chinese images. And as the poem slightly discusses, right, the sort of idea of the neoclassical world to a European mindset begins to come into play in the late 18th and early 19th century with various revolutions, with various sort of overthrows of old aristocratic order, is in many ways a resort to ideas about what the roots of Western civilization are. And so you get neoclassical forms of porcelain being ordered from the export kilns in China, such as the one you see here, with a image of course, George Washington on it, produced for the American market in the early 19th century. Now, America's role in the East India trading, or East Asian trade, was quite late in the sequence of events, partly because America doesn't become independent until these networks are in decline. And of course, the rise of an independent America coincides with the beginning of the decline of colonialism. And of course, colonialism and its various commodities is a central part of our origin myth and our nature, right? Before we were an English colony, and tea and the English, or the Boston Tea Party, is of course the sort of powder keg that sets off, according to many narrative myths of American history, our revolution, our independence. The American East India trade begins in the 1780s, but it's very short-lived, lasting till the early 19th century. And then, of course, taking different forms. And when I talk about the East India trade, I'm talking about, in particular, East India trading companies modeled after the Dutch and English versions. And by the middle of the 19th century, we're seeing this sort of extended disintegration and reformulation of colonial empires. Again, in Britain, as in the rest of Europe, the fad for China had worn off. They'd lost their American colonies. And there were efforts to get more money out of what trade routes they did have and what colonies they did have. That is the Indian subcontinent and coveting, at least, of more East Asian trading and colonized areas. Because up until the middle of the 19th century, trade with China was limited to one city, Canton. And overall, the East India trade had created a drain in the 18th century on the British economy. And the increased frustration with East India trading, with the so-called trade imbalance, the limited venues for trade, the limited manners of trade, the fact that silver was really the only thing accepted for trade, produced one of the more notorious moments within British colonialist, interventions into the world economy. That is the smuggling of opium, which was produced in another British colony, India, into China in order to balance the trade. So you have one colony being used to impose a sort of semi-colonial rule on China because, like the American legend, this consumable substance, opium, is a central part of the story of the decline of the Chinese Empire. When Lin Zexu, who was the governor of Canton, throws overboard a giant shipment of opium because it was illegal to trade opium from a British ship, the British seized this opportunity to declare war on China. This is the beginning of the Opium War, the first of the Opium Wars, which is handily won by the British, who then impose unequal treaties on China that allow for open trade and that then begin to drain wealth from the Qing Empire. And this really is the beginning of the end of the Chinese Empire. Of course, you can still get porcelain from China nowadays, whether it's in the antique form, you're going to pay $700,000 for it, right? Or in its newer, slightly more affordable form. One tells the story of the rise and fall of empire and of trade routes and of the early modern economy. And the rising prices for such antiques indicates perhaps the rise of a new Chinese empire, because most of the buyers that are driving the price up for these objects are Chinese buyers, wealthy off of the developing economy of the 90s and early aughts and the 10s. And interested in investing their money in things that also help to burnish their social status, like antiques. And the other, of course, of these kinds of objects, the cheaper version, is pleasant to eat and drink with. So the next time you feel the cool handle of a mug as you're sipping your hot coffee, or the ring of a fork, or you hear the ring of a fork off of a plate with blue and white decorations that you've just swept clean of a delicious meal that a friend, spouse, or restaurant, as we reopen restaurants, has prepared for you. Maybe you'll think back to China, or to Mexico, or to the Netherlands even, and imagine the object that is sitting in front of you in these terms of the early modern global world. That's the end of my presentation. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to any questions or discussions that I'm capable of answering.
Thanks so much, Mike. I am quite certain that my I love my dog mug will not have the street value of $700,000, but I love it anyway, and I will think of it slightly differently tomorrow morning when I'm pouring my coffee. Okay, so we have just a few minutes left. We do have a couple questions if you're still available to answer for us. All right, let's see. Here's a good one that came in actually during the webinar. How can you tell the difference between real and fake faux porcelain?
Without like breaking it in half. Yeah. So right, these cross sections give you a great Sorry if I'm making you nauseous here. These cross sections give you a great idea, right? But like any kind of material that develops a whole connoisseurship around it, it's a lot of sort of sensory aspects that help you to understand it first. Whether the thing that you're holding is dense or heavy enough to be this, porcelain material, whether the feel of its glaze has the right kinds of inconsistencies to make it an authentic ancient piece, rather than a new imitation ware. And there are plenty of examples of some are fakes, some are reproductions, produced throughout Chinese history, actually, not just for the modern market. Things like sound, right? How does a sound wave move through the dense crystalline material of porcelain, as opposed to the kind of thunk you would get with earthenware, because there's much more space between the particles, and because they're not fused in a kind of crystalline pattern that carries with it sound, or that diffuses temperature or electricity, right? It's not an insulator. And so these are some of the methods. And then, of course, there are certain kinds of technical knowledge that I'm not a great expert on. Again, I'm a painting expert, but the specialist in porcelain can look at the way in which a glaze has run or diffused or not quite consistently distributed in the process of decoration and in firing, and then know that this is an authentic 15th, 16th century, where based on the kind of technological clues, as opposed to an imitation in which you might have something like the kind of iron red, which is used in some glaze that sort of tends to separate, sit on top, and then shift in the glazing process. If it's too perfect, it's probably a later imitation. And those sorts of little bits of knowledge are hard to come by and take a lot of time and effort and handling of real things. So go to an auction preview, look at a bunch of stuff. Some of it might be fake, some of it might be real. Ask to hold things, which you can be allowed to do at auction previews, and that should give you at least an entry level access.
Okay, with that advice, I'm gonna take a professional with me should I ever go bidding on something. Okay, here is another question. Can you explain the difference between porcelain and bone china?
Yeah, so there are lots of terms used, especially in the European description, to describe china, right? And of course, there is this sort of metonymical relationship. The object of porcelain is used or is named by the sort of place in which it comes for most of us, right? Speaking in the English language. But bone china, as I understand it, is a name often applied to porcelain at large, but also to specific materials used mostly in the European versions of porcelain, where you have additive elements like bone ash to the mixture of clay and ground up sort of silicate materials that help to increase the vitrification. And so bone ash is where the idea of bone china comes from. It's added into the basic mixture for the porcelain body.
Okay, all right. Pretty self-explanatory after you say that makes really good sense. Okay, and one last question. This comes from Carolyn. You might be able to shed a little light on this question for her. She says, if something celadon has dark marks on it, is it worth say nothing? She has some from Japan from pre-World War II, and she assumed that it was considered a second. Is that true, false? Do you know?
I wouldn't be able, even if I had it in person, I probably wouldn't be the expert to ask. When I worked in auction houses and in galleries, again, I focused more on painting, although I did have the luxury of handling a lot of porcelains. I would say that it really depends on what you mean by dark marks. If they're sitting up on top of the surface, they might be stains. They might be things that got into or fell onto the glaze in the firing process and therefore melded with the glaze itself. If they're sitting kind of under and in the surface and they're just different shades of the same green material, it can be a slightly inconsistent application of the celadon, and it might be a very old piece. but it might not have been top shelf celadon for its time. And again, this sort of knowledge of how to differentiate that is not something I'm great at doing, but you could, if you wanted, you could send an image to an auction house, pretend that you're going to sell it, and say, I'm sort of interested in evaluating this and possibly putting it up for sale, even if you're not, and then get a tentative evaluation of it.
Oh, that's a good idea. That's a very good idea, especially if you can't go find somebody to, hold it and assess it. I think that's the next best thing. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Michael Hatch. We are so appreciative for having you here today and leading us in this webinar. As a reminder, a recording of this presentation will be available on our website soon. And to learn more about the important work of the Humanities Center here at Miami and other lectures in this series, please go to humanitiescenter.miamioh.edu, as well as you can go to givetomiamioh.org/humanities center to donate and become a friend of the humanities. And as always, please check out our new and archived webinar presentations from the Alumni Association at alumlc.org/MiamiOH. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and special thanks to you, Mike. We do appreciate you. Love and honor to everyone. Have a great night.
Take care.